Okay, good morning and welcome to our Zoom today when the hegemon goes rogue, how to adapt to Washington's belligerent foreign policy. The Georgetown Americas Institute is honored to host Paul Krugman to explore the challenges posed by the United States' turn against the liberal world order it helped build in the aftermath of World War II. From tariffs to threats of occupation and outright military interventions, the Trump administration's belligerent approach to both rivals and allies has upended the norms and institutions that shaped international relations in the post war era. This is our fourth session in the event series titled Latin America and the Geopolitical and Economic Transition, How to Harness the Revolution, that Eduardo Porter and myself are hosting. And we aim to examine how shifting long-term currents are affecting the world, their potential impact on Latin America, and how the region should adapt and react. Eduardo will introduce Paul, who will give some initial remarks, and then Eduardo and myself will conduct a conversation with Professor Krugman, and we will leave some time at the end to take your questions. So please feel free to send them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Eduardo.
Hi, I'm Eduardo Porter. It's an honor to have Paul with us, one of the world's most eminent living economists, winner of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2008 and the John Bates Clark Award of the American Economic Association in 1991. He's a research professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. For 25 years, he wrote a column in the New York Times, and in December of 2024, he took his writing to Substack. Now, in a recent post that I read, Paul commented on an important lesson from Trump and Netanyahu's war against Iran. Tehran's ability to stop shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and throttle the world economy has provided it with enormous leverage. For all their military might, the US and Israel have been unable to pry it back open. And that reveals a critical vulnerability of the integrated world economy that was built over the last 4 decades or so. As Paul pointed out in his piece, this world is so interdependent that there are potential choke points everywhere. Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Panama Canal, and on and on. And this interdependence worked as long as the US, which was the principal architect and main underwriter of the globalized order, supported it and made sure that goods, services, and money kept flowing freely across the economy. And what we're witnessing now is what happens when this underwriter and guarantor just goes crazy, goes rogue. So Paul is going to share some thoughts about what the US's decision to tear the old world order apart entails for the rest of us. Can it be put back together? What could take its place? So Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, so this is going to be probably highly nonlinear, and but let me just say, actually, for some reason, I was thinking about there was an old movie. I should have checked the date on it, but there was an old movie starring Peter Sellers in most of the main roles called The Mouse That Roared, in which the conceit was that there's a small European principality that's in economic crisis, and they figured that the only way to resolve the economic crisis is to go to war with the United States and lose. And this was a sort of Marshall Plan image and it's a possibly romantic notion of what America was in our heyday. If obviously European countries may think that America was this benevolent power. Latin Americans, obviously, not so much. But nonetheless, if you look at what we were like, what happened after World War II, is that the United States built a global order. Uh, Two main rules, one of which was uh, no wars of conquest. You know, they you could all kinds of things could happen, but one thing you did not do is just plain send in the tanks and try and seize another country. And the other was economic. Wasn't initially at all a regime of free trade, but it was a regime of um, limits. That there were basically you would reach trade agreements and then no backsliding, no just ripping up the agreements you made. Those rules were enforced largely by the United States, largely with the combination of the United States having enormous power, but also the United States obeying its own rules. So the U.S. did all kinds of horrible things. It overthrew regimes, and mostly in Latin America, but also in places like Iran. It did all kinds of brutal stuff. We were by no means entirely a benevolent force, even in terms of sheer commercial economics, but we did obey rules. We did not just say we want Greenland, and we did not just say, those trade agreements that we signed, never mind. We've decided to change the terms. And that, by the way, I spent 1 year in the U.S. government, which was highly enlightening because one thing you learn if you spend any time in government is that for the most part, people have no idea what they're doing. Although I think the no idea of what they were doing as of my time there in the 1980s is nothing like the no idea what they're doing that we have now. Um, but one thing that I saw in there was that on my bailiwick, which was trade stuff, if something was proposed and the guy from the U.S. Trade Representative's office, which negotiates trade agreements, said that would be illegal under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, end of discussion. We did not do straight out breaking of the rules. We might bend them, we might do, but we did not. Okay. A lot of people worried about what would happen given relative U.S. decline. The U.S. share of world GDP has been falling mostly because of the rise of China. Just in general, that the U.S. was no longer the kind of dominant power that, after World War II, roughly half of world GDP was the United States. The U.S. military was vastly more powerful. There was Soviet bloc, but that was a kind of a different entity. We worried about would the U.S. be able to maintain its hegemonic role. What nobody expected, I didn't anyway, was that the United States would just plain say, "Hey, never mind. We don't we will conquer places if we feel like it, or at least threaten to do so. We will, threaten Canada, say they should be the 51st state, and that the kind of amazing thing about this." Uh, First, where are we now? In the 14 months of the second Trump presidency, is that all of the tariffs and all of that is extraordinary. But what in some ways is even more extraordinary is that we had solemnly signed agreements on trade with just almost everybody. The U.S. tariffs were supposedly bound by the negotiations that we did in 30 years ago with most of the world. We had free trade agreements with not just with Canada, but and Mexico, which we mostly kind of honored, but with Korea, which we just plain trashed. And so the U.S. is no longer, we are led by people who have no, uh, not just that are breaking the rules, but clearly have no, uh, don't think that the rules apply anymore. So it's just the United States is now like we're powerful. We're going to grab what we want, except we aren't as powerful as we're learning. Day by day. I have a window open over there with price of Brent crude. But anyway, the um, so now what I was writing about, what Eduardo was mentioning, was I was writing about the trading system, which in some ways, there are things worse than disruptions of international trade flows, and again, we're seeing some of that, but it's kind of what I specialize on. And we built, and these things interact. The world, okay, in 1985, there was a lot of international trade, and it was made possible by what were already relatively low tariffs. But the trade that was taking place in 1985 was, first of all, as a share of world GDP, it was about the same amount as it was in 1913. That is, with all of the trade negotiations, all of the expansion of trade after World War II had only gotten us roughly back to the same level of global integration that we had on the eve of World War I. And the trade was still more or less conventional old-fashioned trade. We would ship aircraft to Brazil, and Brazil would send us coffee, whatever. It was exchange of final goods. World trade as a share of world GDP then rather quickly, over of course about 20 years, it doubled. But the amount of the value added of world trade actually remained, it didn't change very much. Roughly speaking, the amount of the average country's resources that it was devoted to producing goods and services from other countries four other countries, didn't actually change. What happened was that the world trading system became vastly more complex. We had all of this trade in intermediate goods. Where was this made? And it's a couple of years old, so it was before the complete rupture with China. And the answer is, well, the last stage in the assembly was in China. But a lot of the things inside it manufactured in South Korea or Singapore, or in some cases even Germany, and those components are made with components from all. So it's this complex web of international trade where, in the course of getting a good to the final consumer, in fact, products will cross multiple borders multiple times. Which, there are a lot of advantages to that. There's advantages of highly labor-intensive stuff can be done in countries that are still labor abundant. It can be, you can have a lot of specialization. I think one of the revelations of recent, actually during COVID already, we were seeing how many things in the world economy actually have sort of one or two points of failure. That the that there's a single industrial cluster somewhere or a single firm somewhere that produces something crucial, and not things that you don't even think about. The extremely advanced equipment that's used to produce advanced semiconductors, really advanced semiconductors, is all made by ASML, which is a Dutch firm. And we don't usually, we don't think about that very much because we don't suspect that the Netherlands may about to have imperial instincts or have a radical Islamic revolution or something, or Christian revolution. We don't, we think of the Netherlands as safe, though God knows in today's world. But there's lots of those points of critical points, which was okay as long as you had the hegemonic power as the guarantor of the system. As long as you thought, that the system will endure, there are rules, countries are not going to use their control over vital resources to do blackmail, because they will be punished, and it'll be punished with, in a lot of ways, the world trading system had turned into a kind of dual hegemony with the United States and the European Union jointly enforcing the rules. And that's, because Europe has a hard time acting as a unit on many things, but not on trade. But it happened, both of the trade superpowers in the West, anyway, China being another story, were committed to the rules of the system. Now not, and we're seeing, hardly a month goes by without us learning about another critical choke point. And yeah, I don't know how this politically, God knows. But I don't know how this turns out, but it's certainly, we need to rethink a lot of what we thought was happening in the world. And in particular, the world is not flat. To talk about a former colleague of Eduardo's and mine, it's actually extremely spiky, and we're now worried about who controls the spikes. I'll stop there. Eduardo, you're muted
You're
still.
muted.
Sorry. That's great. Listen, I wanted to, given what you just said, I'd love to throw a question about how you just said you can't tell the future, which is a very reasonable statement. But if you would kind of like guide us through your thoughts about how the world economy could evolve from here. I mean, how does the unraveling of globalization pan out? Does trade that's now around 55 to 60% of
Right.
GDP, go back to 35% of GDP where it was in the 1980s? Is it feasible to even think of going back to that kind of moment where we didn't have these sort of like integrated value chains? And how would global prosperity kind of like evolve in under such circumstances, if we're retreating?
Yeah, I mean, I can see it as quite possible. I mean, um, So, so we're talking maybe as sort of if this. I mean, I don't think that the sort of airplanes for coffee. That's actually a bad example because Brazil now exports airplanes. But anyway, what the hell? But the kind of conventional. Sorry, just unplugged myself accidentally. Let's hear it for let's hear it for the MagSafes on Macs. Otherwise, you would have I should have sent the computer plunging. Um, the uh, there's still, we're not going to start producing the garment district of New York City, which is where my office is. That's not coming back. We're not going to stop importing clothing from Bangladesh. We're not going to go back to autarky in the world. But rolling back to a kind of 1988, uh, I think we could go a substantial way in that direction, which would be a and that could take place through a combination of uh, the benign story would be that it's industrial policy that major players invest in domestic capacity, even if it's higher cost, and protect it one way or another, because they're afraid of being reliant on the world on faraway countries. Now, hopefully, that would involve sort of uh, affinity blocks. You could imagine, I mean, again, with the United States being a rogue player here, it gets a lot harder. But you can imagine that the EU, um, uh, along with Canada and a few other places, could start to decide that it can't be reliant on these global value chains nearly as much. And the United States might do it, again, maybe a more sophisticated version if we get past current management in the US. Um, that would be, I mean, the effect um, on world GDP would be probably at most a few percent, although that's a big number for anything like this. But it's if you um, if you are uh, there are a couple of areas I work in where the people who think that the subject matters least are the people who really are experts on it. So it's like the international trade is important, but it tends to get the importance gets exaggerated in a lot of people's discussions. The you know the um, uh, inefficiencies in healthcare are a much bigger drag than protectionism in today's world economy. But it's still significant. Um, the thing that I would actually be most concerned about if we have this sort of retreat from globalization would actually be the smaller countries, and often in many cases the poorer countries. This is going to be a little, I said this is going to be very non-linear, but um, I've been around, I've been in this field for a long, long time, and around 1980 people really started to realize that rapid growth through export-oriented industry was a thing. The rise of first the smaller East Asian countries um, became really striking, and we really start. I think the term "newly industrialized economies" what really came is a late '70s term, and so we were starting to realize that something was happening. But people used to say, and I used to say, I was very young then, but I used to say, okay, you can do this for Korea and Taiwan and Singapore and Hong Kong. But, you know, if China tries to do this, there just isn't enough of a market for labor-intensive goods to do that. Well, they did, and the reason it was possible was because the range of potential exports vastly enlarged. And instead of just having to everybody competing for the garment industry, you were able to have a lot of labor-intensive, basically segments of production. So you could have even a relatively advanced technology good, but you could do pieces of it in all around the world. And so Bangladesh is actually in many ways a bad example because they're doing the traditional thing. They're just exporting it. As somebody said, they're not a banana republic, they're a pajama republic. But which is fine, by the way, much better than the alternative. But if you look, even India, China classically, but now, or if we look at what Vietnam exports, it's not so much the classic labor-intensive stuff as it is the labor-intensive pieces of a value chain, which has been great, has really opened the opportunity for rapid economic development to a lot of smaller, poorer countries. And if we retreat from this, it goes, I think that they are really vulnerable players. Now, maybe we can reach deals. Yeah, I mean, the I'd like to think that Mexico is, so far the actual for all of the huffing and puffing, Mexico's role. Mexico is extremely integrated in. There was no such thing as a U.S. car. There was no such thing. There's just a North American auto industry, and so far that's mostly intact. But countries that don't have the convenience of actually bordering on a major market, don't have strong political alliances, could very much find themselves out in the cold. Now, hopeful story that, first of all, that the United States gets a little bit less crazy, but also that to the extent that we lose our minds, we lose them alone. And that um, the EU and India just concluded a major trade deal. And specifics of the deal aside, I was just wildly encouraged to see the uh, negotiations come out with a properly specified, coherent trade deal with a ceremony involving Ursula von der Leyen and Modi, where they, it felt like old times again. That we're there, the Europeans and the Indians are still doing the kind of international diplomacy that we used to be universal. So maybe we can take the United States, which is sort of like 20% of the world economy, and have it go into into wild manic depressive cycles, but the rest of the world continues to do business. But um, I do think that the look. Last point here. I mean, the hyperglobalization story is really about a 20-year story. It's roughly 1988 to 2008. And then it plateaus. It retreats a little bit depending on what metric you use. But, there was already a point where uh, corporations were starting to say, well, our logistics are a little too stretched here. The supply chains are too long. And they began reshoring a little bit of production, not a whole lot, but you can see that it kind of plateaued and then retreated a bit. Um, so it certainly wasn't unstoppable. I mean, um, actually it's the iron law. As soon as Tom Friedman had a best-selling book about the unstoppable pace of globalization, that's when it stopped, right? So not his fault, but that's always how it seems to work. But the uh, I do think that we're probably, well, no, a month ago, I would have said that we're probably looking at an erosion and a retreat, but not a catastrophic thing. Now, the problem is, uh, again, coming back to the choke points and the ability to weaponize them. And with so many players now having the ability to weaponize choke points, then that might force a really radical retreat from globalization. And God knows, we're we're watching it every day.
Yeah.
So, so Paul, following on this reorientation of trade, the last 10 years, Chinese exports to the US have maybe halved, but total Chinese exports to the world have continued to increase. So we have seen a huge reorientation of Chinese exports in the last decade, maybe with an impact on the world economy smaller than what we might have thought. What have been the impacts of this significant reorientation of trade? That's, let's say, a first question. Uh, Secondly, given what you were saying right now, it seems that the marginal value of trade was relatively low. No, the last billions of trade, etc., didn't generate that much impact to the world economy. We were trading at a small margin, and that is being unraveled. But the key issue is more those choke points that
Yeah.
you're mentioning and the geopolitical use of those choke points. And finally, services. No, there's a not much has happened on the service side, where a lot of trade is also going on, no? And that it might be the next phase of weaponization, or you think trading services will continue smoothly
Okay,
in the future?
so let me start. Actually, a lot of the decline in China-US trade is not over the past decade, but over the past year. It's been just amazing how much the share of U.S. imports that's coming from China has declined, and no mystery about it that uh, 50% tariffs will do that. Now, what is unclear to me, and I haven't done enough homework, mostly the the tidal wave of Chinese exports to Europe, which is what they're afraid of, is only starting now. A lot, China is still exporting more than before, but it's mostly going to emerging markets, emerging markets that are a little bit behind China on their, or substantially behind on their rise. And I suspect, but I want to get hold of Chad Bown at PIIE to confirm this for me. But I suspect that a lot of what's happening is that China, the a lot of the sort of final stage um, assembly stuff that was being done in China is now being done in Vietnam or in India, and that the Chinese are that it's not exactly evasion, but there's a sort of a the Chinese have shifted to providing intermediate goods to other countries that then export to the United States. But the United States trade deficit has not come down. Uh, we're importing much less from China, but more from other places, and I suspect that that's actually not that harmful because the Chinese were moving in that direction anyway. The Chinese were already starting to lose apparel. The apparel exports, China was still the biggest, but it was definitely falling behind um, countries, Bangladesh and Vietnam again, which uh, where wages are lower. China has now gotten rich enough that it kind of moves out of the highly labor-intensive final goods stage and starts to produce intermediate goods for that are then used by countries further down the ladder. Um, and that is, yeah, the so far. I mean, um, you know, how do we know that it's this extremely high levels of globalization is not that critical? Well, the fact is that um, this sort of hyperglobalization, which I should say, by the way, what made that possible? Uh, and the answer is uh, be great if it was, the internet or something, but it mostly seems to be shipping containers, right? The box, the containerized shipping with barcodes on the side of the containers did wonders for your ability to have complex international trade. Um, the But it's that stuff is very sensitive to costs, to trade barriers, which tells you that there are alternatives that are not that much more expensive. So that stuff we can, not good to be giving up on it, but it's in some ways a lot less critical. Now, what the sort of political economy thing, the weaponization, that is really critical. I mean, and right now, well, you're seeing the lessons of the conflict over Iran are that once you start to block a major channel of international trade, that's when you find out just how many things you were depending on that channel to provide. So uh, we have we knew about oil and knew about liquefied natural gas. I wasn't even really aware of fertilizer. But that turns out that one of the things that countries with lots of natural gas do, and since shipping it is expensive, is you convert it into fertilizer, helium, um, and then these very kind of postmodern things. It turns out that a lot of pharmaceutical sort of materials, underlying materials, are shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. And then a lot of the pharmaceuticals themselves are transshipped through the airport in Dubai. So all of a sudden, my God, these interdependencies we didn't even know were there, and some of them are fairly critical. The um, but now you start to think about uh, Taiwan, absolutely. It actually, this is really a responsibility to allow basically the whole world economy depend on semiconductors from an island that has ambiguous legal status and which China claims, and against uh, that's a catastrophe that could all too easily happen. There's South Korea produces a lot of crucial tech goods, and obviously that war has never officially ended. And so it's a kind of so those are the things that worry me. I mean, we had it's not entirely resolved, but we were flirting with a crisis over rare earths, which China came to dominate, not because they have the only resources, but because they were willing to invest and bear the extreme environmental costs of extracting them. So there's all of that. The services. That's an interesting story. I mean, 30 years ago, there was a kind of panic about globalization of services. Uh, 20 years ago, I'm sorry. Alan Blinder was talking about the millions and millions of jobs that could be offshored, which never happened on the scale that was expected. So there's substantial trade in services. I'm not sure if there are critical, I haven't thought about it. I mean, the choke points that we know about are mostly actually in financial services, and where the choke point is basically um, about 3 miles south of where I'm sitting. So there's this wonderful book that people haven't seen it by Henry Farrell and Abe Newman called Underground Empire, which was about weaponized interdependence, but they were focused largely on what the U.S. can do and how the U.S. already has, in fact, used its dominance of financial systems to throw its weight around, which is still very much the case. It's still the case that combination of the role of the dollar and the dominance of New York, it's really very difficult for countries to do business if the United States cuts them off, which we have done, most famously to Iran. But now, I mean, I'm not sure that I see the. I may just be unaware
Yeah.
of the other ones. I mean, the one thing I've noticed is that uh, if you manage to reach customer service, uh, after 12 steps in the menu. The Judging from the accents, I'm no longer reaching Bangalore. I'm actually reaching Manila, which suggests that there's competition. There are alternatives in that kind of service.
Uh, listen about helium. Turns out that it's going to be a lot tougher to get an MRI because apparently you need helium for MRIs and
Well,
stuff.
that's more critical, right? Well, in any case, they can't do the MRI. I think MRIs actually require helium as well. So, something like that. So, gosh,
Yeah.
that's an interesting point. Um, yeah, I mean, there certainly has been. I mean, services trade has not had the explosive growth that a lot of people thought it might, uh, but it still has risen gradually. And this is where the internet matters. Oh, I should say one other thing. There's a one point that we always tried to make that always felt kind of abstract was that there's always kind of a race between uh, the technology of transportation or linkage and the technology of production, and that if if you get better at producing stuff but not better at transporting it, then you'd have to tend to have less trade. That all sounds very abstract, but there's actually a very direct thing right now, which is outsourcing versus AI. Again, radiology. You could have somebody in India interpreting your MRI, or you could have Claude or ChatGPT, but definitely not XAI, not Grok, interpreting it. So, but no, that's a very clear thing. It's actually something that you one encounters all the time is that there is now a direct competition. I guess that means that to a certain extent, some of the service trade can be replaced more easily than might have been the case even 2 years ago.
Yeah. What's interesting there is that this again might close down on a development path
Oh yeah.
for poor developing countries, right? The people in Bangalore or Manila or whatever doing these sorts of looking at X-rays are now going to be out of a job.
No, that's right. That's exactly right. That's right. The world GDP, for people who know their, I can always say the impact on world GDP is a triangle, and triangles tend to be small. It's a turn to a less efficient way of doing stuff, but the impact on particular players. So these labor-intensive tasks that have been a huge channel of upward mobility for poorer countries, they may be at risk.
Yeah, yeah. And listen, I wanted to move slightly a bit to the side of trade and to get a sense of the politics of this, of what's driving this, and to what extent do you think that this moment and whether we move on to a more deglobalized world and whatnot depends on American politics? And so, more specifically, is this going to stop when the Trump administration is over? I kind of have a hard time believing that we can get the toothpaste back into the tube. The rest of the world has witnessed millions of Americans elect Trump, not once, but twice.
Yeah.
Who's going to trust us again? And then, the Democrats also share some of the Trump's hostility towards globalization. So, you know, does the world come back to a more, stable, integrated place once Trump is gone or not?
Okay, I have had some thoughts on that, disorganized thoughts, but let me share them. The first is that the the abrupt U.S. turn towards protectionism and ripping up all of our agreements and so on, that is not a broad populist uprising. It's always been amazing, actually, how little support there is in the American public for protectionism. There was really no major demand. Trade policy wasn't even a serious issue in 2024. And for what it's worth, polling says that basically Americans are more favorable towards international trade than they've been in living memory. So this is not broad popular base, and it had had a different guy moved into the White House last year. Even a hardline right winger, but without Donald Trump's particular obsessions, we would probably have much, much lower. We would have much less trade conflict. So this was largely just a personal thing. Um, it's kind of shocking to realize that the world economy can be totally shaken by one guy's uh, obsessions based on what he thought he heard in the 1980s. But that's kind of where we are. Um, that said, uh, Trump put on a lot of tariffs in uh, in his first term. Uh, Started what was by turn standards a relatively low key, but still a trade war with China, and and Biden did not reverse that. There was um, no demand. Not that there we certainly actually did have internationalist globalist types, although somewhat chastened in the Biden administration, but the and they I know actually that they all regard the tariffs on China as unwise. But they also figured that it was politically risky. Anything that looked like being soft on China would be used against them, and so they were willing to leave it alone. And the question, it seems likely that even if we get, whatever, President President AOC or something in 2029, that we will not roll back everything that Trump did. And then the one thing that was true about Biden already, and this is also something we're seeing in Europe, is that the kind of precautionary arguments again for some inward turning for industrial policy that supports self-sufficiency in some industries, um, that has had made a lot of uh, inroads. So although I don't think that I don't think the future Democratic administration or even a future Republican administration would probably do Liberation Day with, tariffs on everybody, and I don't think future administrations will have anything special against penguins. That's that story. But the but will we see a push to have U.S. become self-sufficient in advanced technology, in semiconductors? Will we see some just general kind of hostility to the idea of being too globalized? Yeah. So no, we don't get the toothpaste back in the tube, and or don't get. Question is how much of this gets resolved, and yeah, the uh, you know, gosh, the United States. I mean, as late as into the Obama administration did put a lot of effort and political capital into making trade agreements. Uh, I don't think that's going to happen again, partly because the U.S. political scene is probably not favorable, but also, who will trust us? We've now seen an object lesson that that the United States, and we might say it's just Donald Trump, but I'm not sure about that, and no one else is sure about that. That from a U.S. point of view, a uh, a solemn agreement is a suggestion, and so could be we will not get back to where we were now. You know, it's the sky hasn't fallen from what's happened now, but if we get serious disruption of supply chains, then that will, not just the labor intensive stuff is no longer done necessarily in low wage countries, though that's a catastrophe for those countries. But if we get serious, uh, where the line between geopolitical conflict and economic warfare gets closed, if we try to deny the China chip making machinery, and China denies us rare earths, and then the U.S. tries to extort the Europeans by cutting off the supply of LNG, and the Europeans I'm not quite. They can take. They control the chip making machinery. So you can imagine it was crazy a few years ago, but to imagine a war between basically the United States, which says no natural gas for you, and the Dutch saying no chip making machinery for you. But that's a real concern in looking forward.
And Paul, maybe I mean continuing on these concerns, I think you finish one of your latest pieces with a sentence that you fear, or you're also very concerned about the implications for the world of a U.S. defeat in its war against Iran. So first, I mean, maybe for the audience, just define exactly what you meant by defeat. But secondly, can you expand on your concerns of this outcome?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and by the way, my first Zoom this morning was a closed door meeting where we had some, serious military, national security types talking about, and uh, I basically emerged from that meeting in a sense of blind panic. It looks absolutely awful. And uh, so, I mean, what the defeat would look like is something like the United States, declares victory because Trump will regardless, but in fact, not only fails to achieve regime change or anything like that, but effectively leaves Iran as the gatekeeper of the Strait of Hormuz, and extracting tolls from everybody, imposing conditions on the rest of the Gulf states. You shall not cross us, or we will not allow tankers bearing your oil and natural gas through the strait. Um, that's pretty bad. Let's be clear. This is not a this is a um, it's a thuggish regime, but it's a thuggish fanatical regime. You really don't want them in control of one of the world's key waterways. But also the effect that everybody will now consider the United States, the democratic nations as paper tigers. So it basically opened the door for everybody to become far more aggressive, both these economic blackmail attempts and or economic blackmail initiatives, and also You know, the we've had for everything, we've had a de facto prohibition on wars of conquest for a long, long time. And uh, the bad old days may be back again. I mean, just uh, uh, yeah, one of the people that was talking, saying in terms of uh, the historical analogies for what's happening right now, that his example, his preferred analogy is World War One, where a local conflict in Serbia just kind of expands through concentric circles, and you end up with a world at war. Now he said that's a little extreme here, but that's kind of what you worry about. So, I mean, to be honest, I don't see how that's avoided at this point.
Okay. Listen, it's I think it's time to
Yeah.
open the floor to some questions from the audience, and here's a kind of interesting one that touched on something that you mentioned that you touched upon earlier from Antonio Ortiz Mena, which he asked you what your thoughts are on Carney's proposition of middle powers getting together, right? I mean, I think the quote is, "This is not naive multilateralism, nor is it relying on diminished institution. It is building the coalitions that work issue by issue with partners who share enough common ground to act together." On trade, is this a viable long-term, path forward, or just a short-term, coping mechanism?
Well, it can work up to a point. I mean, the great lesson of post-war, the Pax Americana, was that actually countries can cooperate. And now I think to some extent, Carney was obliged to say middle powers because he couldn't pretty much openly say is Jesus Christ, our neighbor has gone mad, and we need to cozy up as much as possible to the Europeans and everyone else we can. But it's not just that. I mean, so you could imagine that there could be a fair bit. I mean, so far at least, uh, no other major players have gone crazy. So it's not. There's Canada. There's obviously Canada, Australia. Um, Japan is, I think Japan would count as a middle power in this stuff. Maybe South Korea as well, and and then the EU for all of its. Actually, the EU is actually in some ways. I mean, they will always disappoint your hopes, but you look at the way that the EU has stepped in to basically take over from the United States in Ukraine. That's actually pretty impressive. So, but yeah, I mean, there's something like that. The idea that a world order without the United States can at least hold on to some of what we achieved. I think that is realistic. Now, Carney, as I said, I think Carney, he's no fool, and uh, he's couching it in terms that avoid making it too confrontational. But I think that is definitely uh, it's not empty. And yeah,
So, Paul, I mean, there's another question that, I mean, switches our discussion again in a very non-linear way, but to a
yeah.
very important issue in the world economy, AI. If AI-driven manufacturing from Wichel Reme, if AI-driven manufacturing allows a small number of firms to control both production and automation infrastructure, are we moving toward a post-labor economic model? If so, what replaces wage-based social stability as a primary mechanism for distributing wealth and maintaining global economic balance?
Okay. I mean, there's a huge question. The economics of AI is still very much up in the air. I mean, I think at this point, we do know that it's serious. This is not just, uh, in some ways, by looking at the text-based, by having conversation with ChatGPT, belittled what can be done, and the ability to um, uh, do coding on the fly and all of that um, is is starting to look like it's quite significant. Um, Now, whether it's bigger than the internet, we don't know, but this is real. Um, will it lead to increased concent? There are two questions. One is, will it lead to increased concentration of few firms? That is actually that's not at all clear. At least a few weeks ago, before I guess it was pre-Iran war, but so that's how I date things now. But it was there was this markets were totally roiled by this memo from a research firm suggesting that AI would, it's the Citrini, and their premise was actually that AI would drastically reduce market power, that it would take the platform. I mean, their hypothetical example of a company destroyed by AI was DoorDash, because they were claiming that people could use AI that gig workers could use AI to, handle basically no, they wouldn't be reliant on any one platform. So they were actually arguing for a deconcentration, which is, possible. Um, um, but in some ways, less important. I think that market power is always a possible concern, but I'm worried about this could be highly capital using and labor saving. That's the story. I mean, that's kind of our story about the Industrial Revolution. The reason why was 40 years before workers saw any gains from industrialization may have been. Obviously the data are pretty poor for 1815, um, but and that's a real possibility. Now, what may be true, though at this point everything is uncertain, but the we are very much in a situation where AI accountants, AI, I mean AI, I'm it wasn't that long ago when machine translation was a total joke, and now it basically who needs translators anymore? Uh, and but on the other hand, we're still, I think, quite a ways from having robot plumbers or carpenters. So we may actually see that this is good for manual labor. Uh, and uh, Now, is that enough? Are we going to see if the share of labor in GDP declines by 15 points, which is not, possible, that really does undermine our a lot of what our society is about, and uh, bearing in mind also that not just that how will people live, but even if we do find some way of universal basic income is not smart given where we are now because it costs too much to provide an adequate standard of living. But maybe we go in that direction. But then what? Because jobs are a lot more than just a source of income. They're a source of dignity. They're how people define their lives. And I don't know uh, the the fantasies. Kurt Vonnegut published Player Piano about a world in which automation has destroyed work. He published that in 1950, and it was not at all what the post-war generation was like, but it is uh, not to say it could never happen. So times when I'm glad I'm 73.
Gosh, gosh. Listen, there's another question here that brings us back to our current, issues in Iran and so on. And it's from a guy from Gabriel McKern. If the U.S. loses credibility militarily, in Iran now or in some other conflict soon, like it has in trade, um, what is the outlook for the dollar, for U.S. dollar supremacy? That's the question. And if I could, I would embed it in I would like to add to it a question framing our situation as a situation of insurance. The United States used to provide all sorts of insurance to the world economy and the world, security. It's armed forces and the dollar and trade agreements and so forth. And now it seems that as these things fall apart, you've got a lot of countries that are going to have to like self-insure, financially, if the dollar somehow loses its perch as a reserve currency where you put your money, in treasury bonds, and where there's no longer trust that the U.S. is going to keep the Malacca Strait open or whatever. It's a country where a lot of these insurances are going to go away, and then it's going to become like a lot more costly
Yeah.
for a standard country to just be around.
Okay. So there's the narrow issue of the dollar, and um, this is, by the way, this was my really prime example of where the people who study it most are least impressed by how important it is, and the people who don't are. So the idea of that the reserve status of the dollar is critical to U.S. supremacy is just not, the math doesn't work. And it's also very, very hard to dislodge. There was a great old essay by Charlie Kindleberger 60 years ago now, about the saying that the role of the dollar as the global currency is similar to the role of English as the global language. Is basically everybody uses it because everybody else uses it, and it's extremely difficult to shake that. I mean, even if the United States is a becomes a second-rate power in the eyes of the world, it's going to be a long time before international business is conducted in Mandarin. And similarly, it's going to be a long time before international business is conducted in yuan. So now there is, I mean, we could destroy it if we make it really. One thing you could do is have a situation in which U.S. policy is so irresponsible, or in various ways. I mean, if we could have a runaway inflation, or we could have the U.S. trying to abuse what's left of its financial power and and slap controls on movements of funds in and out of the United States, or try to confiscate foreign deposits, and that's the dollar system does depend. It's the situation where everybody, basically every bank in the world, needs to be able to conduct business in New York, roughly speaking, and that gives the United States a lot of special leverage. Not that much economic benefit, but some. And if the United, if it's really not safe, then people will switch out of dollars, and not clear to what. So you can have a system with a lot more friction in it than we have now. How big are those frictions? Um, the United States essentially froze Iran out of global finance a long time ago, and they pay a price. But on the other hand, there's not, well, about to say there that uh, um, there wasn't grass growing in the streets of Tehran. Now maybe there's rubble to play with. They function. Russia. The financial sanctions against Russia have been pretty effective. They were shut out of SWIFT, which is the interbank settlement system, and it's hurting them, but the Russian economy has not collapsed. So the world can function. It just functions less efficiently. It's probably not catastrophic. I'm not sure where there was more to the question, but I don't remember.
But I'm, I mean, some lessons or thoughts for some Latin American countries of this complex world we're living on. I mean, more self-insurance, more regional integration,
Yeah,
trade diversification. I mean, what are your thoughts on how the region, and finally, I mean, is the region, I mean, has been put at the center of the US foreign policy, but that's because the region is relevant or because that's a place where the US can play around without a lot of pushback?
yeah, it's mostly the latter. The U.S. is playing around. I should this will have to be my last response. I mean, part of the answer is I don't know, but I think that Latin America, I mean, it's already moved substantially towards less reliance. I mean, there are trade. Aside from Mexico and Central America, but go further. Once you go into South America, the United States is not the dominant trading partner. It's uh, Brazil, Argentina are effectively trilateral. There's the U.S., but there's in many cases China is the bigger partner, and the Europeans are comparable, which is also true of the geography. I think a lot of the uh, Trump administration's idea that we're going to basically be able to run things in Latin America is based on not actually looking at a globe. Brazil is not close to the United States. It's a long way from the United States. It's a long way from every place. But no particular reason to think that the U.S. can play a dominant role there. Um, the self-insurance, I mean, one thing that Alejandro, you would know this, especially given our, our histories. Uh, the back uh, in the past, there was original sin. Latin American countries could not borrow in their own currencies. They were borrowing in dollars, which gave the U.S. a really special role. Now, to a large extent, they do borrow in their own currencies, and that's a form of insurance. They're not nearly as vulnerable to uh, to vicissitudes of policy up here. Yeah, it's a long way. I mean, um, in general, I mean, the U.S. hegemonic role in Latin America was greatly reduced, I think, already even before Trump. I mean, sorry, I'm gonna be nostalgic for a minute. Now I'm gonna probably have to sign off in a minute. But the um, Rudy Dornbush, who we both studied with, he liked to be genially offensive, and he used to insist that the meetings of the Latin American Econometric Society should all be held at the central, at a single, they rotate among different places. And he said, we should keep them consistently at that central place, the center of Latin America, which of course is Miami. And that I don't think many people would think of it that way anymore. So uh, but yeah, I mean, actually, I'm kind of, uh, I don't know. I'm not. I used to spend a lot more time thinking about issues in Latin America. Although, as always, as our Secretary of War says, I only speak American. But the uh, and I spent a lot less time thinking about it once the epicenter of crisis in the world started to be here. But I mean, what strikes me is that Argentina's Argentina always, but Brazil really has carved out a substantial amount of economic and policy autonomy. That doesn't mean things are great, but maybe Latin America and increased local integration. Maybe Latin America can ride out the storm.
Well,
Thanks so
thank you
much,
very much,
Thanks a lot.
Andre. Well, we hope we can rejoin with you in the future. And thanks for the conversation.